Welcome to the Domain Name Wire podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Alleman, and this is episode number 551. My guests on this week's show know what makes a great name. Maria Seifer and Laurel Sutton are co-founders of the naming agency Catchword. The firm has been behind names like VW's Atlas, the freelancing site Upwork, and tech company Asana. They've also done brand naming products for TikTok, Home Depot, and Starbucks. They're also domain investors in a way, and the way they stumbled into it is very different from, I think, most listeners. It's a fascinating conversation, so stay tuned for that. First, a word from our sponsor. Our sponsor this week is Sav.com, and it's low-cost back ordering. You can back order .com domains at Sav for only $10.49. They have a lot of success with non.com domains. In fact, I recently bought Nectarine.io in an expired domain auction there. And each week, when I highlight some of Sav's expired domain auctions for the Domain Name Wire app, I'm surprised by the good names it's caught. Last week, there were auctions for Impact.co and Circuit.dev. Start back ordering domains for just $10.49. Sign up for an account at sav.com/DNW/backorder. That's sav.com/DNW/backorder. I mentioned Sav's expired domains in the Domain Name Wire app. If you haven't downloaded the app yet, on your iPhone or iPad, go to dnw.com/Apple, or on your Android device, it's dnw.com/Android, or just search in the app stores. Let's talk about some news in the domain business from the past week before we chat with Maria and Laurel. First up, Team Internet Group has laid off 200 people, which is about a quarter of its employee base. The company runs domain name registrars, including Moniker and Internet.bs, and those businesses are doing fine. The issue is its domain monetization business. The company has been a leader in traffic arbitrage, and Google's decision to opt all advertisers out of domain parking has decimated its finances. Revenue in the first half of the year was down 36% compared to the first half of last year, and its search monetization business was down 52%. And worse news, Google hasn't even finished opting all advertisers out of parked domains yet, so the fall could continue. Team Internet and other companies are rapidly switching to Google's Related Search for Content product, also known as RSOC, but it's not the same as AdSense for domains. Now, my first thought when I saw Team Internet's report was that, man, Sedo must be suffering as well because the company has done a lot of search arbitrage, but I was wrong. Its parent company, Ionos, recently reported earnings and said that the ad tech segment, which is essentially Sedo's aftermarket and domain parking business, was up 73% compared to last year. Now, it did give the caveat that the first half of last year was particularly weak, but it also said the transition from AdSense for domains to Related Search for Content is going quite well. I also suspect its domain sales are better this year than last. In other news, a shout out to domain investor Logan Flatt for selling super.xyz for $288,000 at Atom. Logan is having a heck of a year, and if you want to hear more about it, go back to episode 547 of this podcast. That was about a month ago, where he talks about his sales. And I think this sale is more proof that successful domain investing can stretch beyond .com names. In one of the most egregious reverse domain name hijacking cases of all time, a complainant recently submitted forged documents and emails from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to try to bolster their case. In an effort to get chafezero.com, AK Associates and Alina Chung submitted a fake trademark registration document. The panelist immediately knew it was fake because the applications had been submitted only weeks before the case was filed. The panelist also believes additional emails the complainant submitted purporting to be from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office were fake. Unstoppable Domains has filed a patent for a method of taking down blockchain-based domain names. One of the criticisms of so-called Web3 domains is that it's a Wild West. And frankly, if you want businesses to get involved and adopt names, there needs to be some way to police those names. The patent describes a way to do just that. Well, after you finish listening to this podcast, search for the Planet Money podcast that was published last week. It was a fun podcast where they interviewed Rob Schutz of Snagged and Domain King Rick Schwartz, as well as the man who owns Milk.com. All right, now let's chat with Maria and Laurel. My guests this week are Maria Seifer and Laurel Sutton. They are co-founders of the naming agency Catchword. Maria, Laurel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you guys on the show. We met at the ICA conference in January in Las Vegas, and you have a fascinating backstory. So first of all, what is the origin of Catchword?
Well, throwing back our minds 30 years here, I guess we're dating ourselves. So Laurel and I actually met at another naming firm, which was sort of a pioneer in the naming field. And back then there were very, very few naming firms. There was so much demand for it at the time. If you can imagine back in 95 to the late 90s, it was the era of the dot-com boom. And suddenly there were all of these startups and they needed names and they needed domain names. And so Laurel and I and a third partner who's no longer at Catchword decided to start our own firm, which was Catchword.
So what are some brands that y'all have named?
I haven't done a tally at this point, but I'm guessing, Laurel, what do you think? We've probably named about 1,000 things, but
I think so. Yeah, and we've been very deliberate about naming in very many different industries. So when we started, we were very tech focused because of where we are located, which is Oakland, right next to Silicon Valley. And many of our initial clients were, in fact, tech clients. We were on retainer with Cisco for a while. We did a lot of startups, but we also worked with a lot of larger companies. But as time went by, and especially after the bubble burst, we diversified into anything that we could. So we've done food and beverage naming, clothing naming, services, all kinds of products, services, companies, and globally as well. So it hasn't been just in the United States.
And well, some of the names that might be most familiar to people in the tech space, we named Asana a number of years ago. We also named the global freelance platform Upwork, which was a
fan of that. I'm a fan of up names myself. So
great.
You guys started that, I guess.
I like to think so, but don't have any data to back that up, but it seems like it might be the case. We named the Atlas for Volkswagen, or some automotive naming. And recently we named the popcorn meter for Rotten Tomatoes. I don't know if you...
Okay.
And
I'm a fan of the popcorn meter.
Oh, I love that you're a fan of that. And that was a very fun one to name. And we also just named the Comcast is spinning off. There are a lot of companies that are kind of splitting in both the media space and the food sort of snack space at the moment. But NBCU is splitting into two companies. And one of the companies is going to hold MSNBC and CNBC and E and Rotten Tomatoes and Fandango. And that's going to be a separate publicly traded company. And we just named that Versant. So that is...
I should ask, Did you name the new MSNBC?
Thankfully, no. You mean MS Now?
I didn't want people to think that.
Thank you for clarifying that for us up front. To me, it sounds like a piece of Microsoft software.
Yeah, exactly.
And also just, it expands to a very kind of forced acronym. I think it stands for My Source of News, Opinion, and World.
Trying to squeeze an initialism into something that doesn't exist.
Exactly. And well, nobody is going to really remember what it stands for anyway. They're just going to call it MS Now. So, but the new company Versant will hold MS Now. So, yes. And
you've done work product naming for companies like Starbucks and Home Depot as well. So it's really a lot of big names, TikTok as well. So I'm sure many people listening have heard of many of these brands that you've already mentioned. So one of the interesting things too is you own a portfolio of brandable domain names. So how did you generate this portfolio?
I can kick that off, and Laurel, feel free to jump in. It's an interesting story. So I guess it's about 25 years at this point.
Such a long time ago.
We were presenting to Microsoft, speaking of Microsoft, and at the time so this was about the year 2000, we would present 30, 40, 50 names at a time, and anything that had .com availability, we would bold. It was sort of a basic presentation style back then. And our client literally, upon seeing these bolded .com domains, said, "Oh my God, those are available domain names," and excused himself from the room to start registering these domain names. Laurel was actually in the meeting. I was not in the meeting, so I don't know if you want to add some color to the story, but
he didn't say why he was leaving. He just said, "I got to go do something, and I'll come right back." He didn't say it immediately, but when we got to the end of the presentation, we clarified that the names in bold were in fact available as .coms, and he said something jokingly like, well, not anymore, I just registered them. We sort of sat there with our mouths open like, hey man, that's not cool. Like, you can't just do that. And to his credit, he eventually did give them back, which was it took a while, but I think he agreed that, doing it without telling us that he was going to do it was really not a very ethical thing to do.
Wow.
But it really got us thinking about the value of .com domains. So up until that point, we knew that most companies would want them, but we'd never really thought about investing in them as an asset that we could have going forward. But I think that experience really proved to us that having a name with an exact .com that we could offer to a client would be a huge advantage over what other naming companies might be offering.
Right. So that was really the start of it. We have kind of the perfect business model to generate brandable domains, because if you think about it, for any given project, a client's only going to take one, and it may or may not be something with .com availability. And here we have lists, master lists, sometimes almost always over 1,000 names, sometimes over 2,000 names. So in fairly short order, we started to run these lists through programs to see what was available, and we started to register them. But I will say it wasn't without a fair amount of internal discussion about what constituted cyber squatting at the time. Back then, as a naming firm, we definitely had some folks within the company who thought it was, we just shouldn't be doing this. We're keeping other people from owning these names. And my argument was always that these were completely new invented ideas, and these were not registering Coca-Cola.com. We were, registering things that nobody had thought of before.
Yeah. And we were very concerned about violating UDRP too, because that had newly come in, and we knew that you could be going through one of these negotiations and lose the domains. And so we were very careful that we never registered anything in bad faith, which is one of the 3 pillars of that. Like, we weren't trying to sell them back to people. We weren't doing it to take them away from someone else. We generally did trademark checks before we would register some of the domains anyway, to make sure that they legitimately weren't belonging to someone else. So
sure. Well, especially if you're going to present them to someone, right?
Exactly.
I'm sure that's
so we always tried
cursory check.
We tried to be very careful about that.
So yeah, I do want to ask you about, because you have been on the receiving end of UDRP, but before we get there, so how many names are in your portfolio now?
So we have over 2,000 at this point, and for up until literally about 6 months ago, we had a site called the Catchword Accelerator. We still do. That was constituted the repository of all of these domains. But being honest with you, our attention was really focused on the catchword naming side of the business. And for the most part, these domains really just sat there until somebody was interested in a domain. They would type it into a browser, and then they would find us. And just through the course of doing that, we sold Feastables to Mr. Beast and Natrel to Johnson & Johnson. I mean, we've sold some really big name domains over the years, but by and large, we really weren't doing very much to market our brandable domains. We were definitely not a brand bucket situation. But at the ICA conference this year, I had a chance to meet Darpin of Atom, and I'm just super impressed by everything he's doing over at Atom. So very recently, we've just ported our entire portfolio over to Atom. I mean, we still have them listed in some other aftermarkets as well, but Atom's doing a great job for us. And I think we've sold 5 since the beginning of July.
Okay. Yeah, we're recording this September 5th, so beginning of September. And so just extrapolating maybe here, so 5 in a couple months. So granted, this is summer months, but let's just say maybe aiming for about 30 a year, which would be about a 1.5% sell-through rate, which is a great target that people go for. So,
well, thanks for doing that math. I
don't know if it was right. No, someone will call me out if it was wrong.
That absolutely sounds right. And I will say we also lowered the price on a lot of the domains in the course of moving them over at the suggestion of the Atom folks. I think that was good.
How do you generally price your names?
It's really based on, as everybody who's listening to this podcast knows, I mean, the value of a domain is not precise, and it's really sort of what the buyer will pay. And given that we've been a naming firm for 27 years at this point, we have a really good sense of what constitutes a great name. So if it's short and easy to spell, I mean, certainly if it's a real word, we only have a couple of those, but it's just what we think is where there's going to be a lot of demand for the name. With that said, we're now looking at some of the metrics that Adam provides us to see how many people are actually landing on the site and whether there's interest in it. And I think in a recent podcast that you talked about the new Adam feature of showing trademarks that have recently been registered that correspond to domains. So we're looking at all of those things as factors in pricing out a domain. But fundamentally, it's all the factors that make a name great. And if it's a great name, it's going to be a higher price.
Would you say they range? Actually, I mean, I can go take a look at your portfolio, but they range from low four figures and up. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, probably 80% of them are in the $3,000 to $8,000 range, and then we do have a few that are much higher than that, but that would be the sweet spot.
And all 2,000 of these names were hand registered, right? They were available.
All 2,000 of them. Yeah.
Okay. And it's kind of interesting because in some ways you didn't name Feastables, but you came up with that name and thought it was a great name before Mr. Beast. So it's kind of fascinating. And I just looked at catchwordaccelerator.com, which forwards to your Adam store the other day. I mean, names like Nature Edge, Bright Palette, favefactor.com. These are all just, you look at them and you're like, oh yeah, these people know what they're doing.
Oh,
so,
thank you.
All the ideas that don't see the light of day necessarily because the client goes with something else. So do any of those, do you recall like what type of client you were working with at the time that came up with them or?
I think that this is the fascinating thing about what we do. Like right now, we're working with a vet diagnostics company. We've done a bunch of projects with them. So we might have a lot of domain names that relate to pets and animal care and so forth. And we just did a project for Rivian that was around micromobility. And so names coming out of that might relate to transport and automotive. And we've done a ton of snack foods and entertainment. So given that we're running all of these lists through programs, you're going to get huge variety of names. And if it's a really specific thing, we probably wouldn't register a domain around that.
But certainly if it'd be specific to the client.
But one of our domains is Romeo, spelled ROAM. So like the Rome part with IO at the end. I think we were doing a lot of mobility projects, 1 point, Laurel, right? So it probably came out of something like that.
Yeah, there was a period where for some very strange reason, we ended up working with 3 different bottled water companies right in a row, which I don't know why that happened, but it did. And so we ended up with this huge pool of names that reflected different water qualities. And I think at that time we registered a bunch. I'm not sure if we still have some of those, but there was definitely a period where that was the type of name we were developing and the type of name that we were registering. And they weren't so specific that they couldn't be used for other things, right? They were about freshness and taste and ice and the wind and all of these very evocative things that you were meant to get from the name of the water. And we just go in cycles like that. There might be pet food, there might be snack foods for a while. You just never know what kind of project is going to come next.
So let me ask you, let's use that Romeo example, because, as a domain name person, I say, oh, that fails a radio test, right? It's something it's misspelled. I get it, right? When I hear
misspelled like Google. So terrible name, Google, misspelled. Nobody will ever spell it correctly.
I had a a marketing professor on recently who did research on these types of misspellings and, the cognitive dissonant, the issues that they create and how to overcome those. But what is your take on a name like that? I mean, you mentioned, yes, Google. That's made up. It's misspelled. Now we all know how to spell it. There's LYFT, which now we all know how to spell, that sort of thing. What is your take as a naming firm on those types of names?
Laurel, do you want to go first? As not just a naming person, but a linguist?
Yeah. So my background is in linguistics, and it cuts both ways, I think. Partly there is, you say cognitive dissonance, you see a word, it's not spelled the way you're expecting it to be spelled. And that can cause a little bit of confusion. Oh, it's spelled weird. What's up with that? But on the other hand, because it is spelled differently, it's more memorable. So when you think about brands that have made it that are misspelled, and I was joking about Google, but it's a misspelled word, even though many people didn't know what a Google, Googol, meant people who did, I remember this very clearly, were up in arms. Oh, it's misspelled. How can you misspell a word like this? But then you look at things like Flickr or Grindr or any of the other well-known brands that are misspelled. But that's what makes it a memorable name, is that it's different. And I think if the brand is marketed properly, you play on that and you can turn that into an asset and not just, we couldn't get the exact .com domain, so we had to do this weird spelling.
Yeah, if I could just tag on, I think my take on that would be there are misspellings and then there are misspellings. If it's a misspelling that enhances the meaning of the word, I mean, in the case of Romeo, you're taking the Romeo and Juliet reference, but you're embedding in it the word ROAM, which presumably is going to relate to the business model of the company that's adopting the domain name. So it's going to be intuitive and it's going to make sense. It's misspelled for a reason. We named one of the original streaming services Voodoo, which is VUDU, quite a few years back. And of course, that's a misspelling of VOODOO. But that's the kind of misspelling.
By a domain name company.
Right.
Enough.
But that's the kind of misspelling people are going to see it once and they're instantly going to get it. And it's shorter, and it's just completely natural once you see it. So I think the key thing is there a reason for the misspelling, and is it going to cohere in the mind of the user or the recipient of the information as being natural?
Sure. I mean, to nitpick, you mentioned Flickr. I was just looking up here a 2007 story about the correctly spelled with the E domain receiving 150,000 type-ins a month from people who are looking for the site, right? The site that was misspelled. So do you have conversation? I mean, do companies think about this from a web perspective and a word of mouth and a radio test and that sort of thing?
They definitely do. It's one of the considerations, and we always test the client's boundaries on these sorts of things. So when we are doing intake and going through it all, are they willing to go out on a limb and have something that's spelled a little bit differently if it is in fact really memorable? And along with the misspelling, what Maria was talking about before, like with Romeo, the spelling doesn't affect the pronunciation. So that's a very important consideration as well. If the spelling is going to make you pronounce it in some very off-putting way, that's out. No matter how cool it might look, if there's a bunch of X's in it or something, if people can't pronounce it, that's going to kill the name for sure. But if it is something that makes sense, like Google and Flickr, you can look at that and you can pronounce it pretty accurately. The other part of it is, too, sure, people might type in flickerer.com and go to the wrong website, but we've found, and I think most of our clients agree, most people just type stuff into the search bar and then they click on whatever comes up. So very rarely do people go to the address bar and type in http://www, and then the name. No one does that except
they tend to search for the actual domain in Google, right?
And it's going to turn up. And so that's part of the marketing, right? Is making sure that your brand is going to be high enough in the search results that when people are searching for the thing, it's going to be, number 1 or 2, whether it's sponsored or not. And people will just click on it, and that's how they're going to learn how it's spelled.
Yeah, I guess to be fair, the Flickr story was from 2007. The way people navigate the web has certainly changed a lot. So.
If I could make one more point about the Flickr, the drop vowel convention, there's also the bandwagon tendency of companies to follow the lead of a successful adopter of a certain type of misspelling. So certainly the drop E convention at the end was sort of big for a while. So if you go in that direction, you can also end up sounding kind of dated. Like this is a circa 2007 kind of company. So you just want to avoid misspelling trends. And there's all kinds of naming trends. There's names that end in LY and names that end in IFY and
names that start with E,
Absolutely.
E.
Yes. Yeah.
Talk about dating yourself to 1999 if you have that in front of it. So interesting. So let's talk about the UDRP that we mentioned earlier. So what was the name?
It was Upterra.
Speaking of up names there.
Speaking of up names, that might have actually been something that came out of that exercise. I'll have to go back and look. But it was a name that we registered 11 years before it started to be used by a company that now exists at upterra.co. I guess I want to be a little careful about how I frame this. You can actually go to upterra.com and read all the salacious details, but essentially we were contacted by them multiple times under false pretenses with no attempt to negotiate. Just sort of this wasn't quite what it was, but my girlfriend is about to open a jewelry store. What's the price of this name? Like that kind of thing. And so multiple attempts were made that we were later able to track to them, but no attempt at negotiation. And then we got slammed with a UDRP action. And it was then we attempted to educate them on the fact that we had registered this domain so far in advance of their use to no avail. And it proceeded to the upshot of us getting a 3-person panel ruling of reverse domain name hijacking in our favor.
So let me ask you first, kind of when you got that UDRP, how did you feel, right?
This is going to turn into a domain therapy session. I like it. Horrified, terrified. This just happened last year. And as we talked about before, we'd been registering domain names for 24 years with, I like to think, a lot of integrity. And I think the first thing was confusion. And thank goodness we work a lot with Bill Sweetman, who is one of the best
Name
people
ninja
on this planet. He is the name ninja. And he suggested we talk with Zach Muscovich, who's also one of the finest human beings around. And so
they're both Canadian. So,
it's probably not a coincidence. So the two of them, well, Zach in particular, we immediately got to talking. And I think the initial fears were kind of calmed down by the fact that we had such a strong case. We just had done nothing wrong. And we had all the receipts, as they say. So Zach was actually able to turn it into kind of an interesting, fun process, to be honest. I mean, just because I never felt like we had anything to worry about. It was unpleasant though at the same time.
Sure. And, it costs money, it takes time, takes mind share, that sort of thing. I think whenever you have a case where the company didn't exist when you registered the domain name, that is a slam dunk case for the domain owners. So that's good. But as you mentioned, a 3-person panel found plan B, as we call it, reverse domain name hijacking. They first tried to acquire the name and then they ended up filing it. And just looking through some of the details of the case, you had asked $18,500 to, which isn't like, hey, it's $1 million, it's $100,000, that sort of thing, which I imagine if they wanted it now, you might ask for a little bit more money. And at least add your legal fees on top.
Yes. Well, that was, negotiating domain names we clearly would have been willing to negotiate. And so the fact that they never just said, well, we can give you $8,000. What's your best? There was none of that. So it was kind of remarkable to me that they would rather invest their money in legal fees than just a straight, honest domain negotiation.
And now, as you mentioned, if you go to Upterra.com, there is a story about there's reverse domain name hijacking. This company still operates on the .co, right? So
Correct.
Every time someone mistypes that, which I'm sure they frequently do, they get to see the ethics of that company that they are looking for. So
yes.
This brings up something else. This is the only UDRP you've been faced with, right?
Thankfully, yes.
Do you receive other threats? Or?
No, that was the one and only. And honestly, part of the reason we put the notice up that we did at .com and the fact that we went through the whole 3-person panel thing was sort of to put people on notice that we're not to be trifled with. Yes, hopefully it will have that effect. We don't want to invite other UDRP actions. So we wanted to show that we're willing to take it all the way if we need to.
Right. So here's a case. The company went with Co because Com was taken. You had it. So my next question is, what do you tell companies when the domain name isn't available or might not? Obviously, you work with Bill Sweetman sometimes to help acquire it, but how does that conversation go? And are there times where it's like, absolutely, you're not going to be able to acquire it. It's already in use by a big company. And then what do you say?
It depends on the client. We always try to take a very strategic approach to this. So if it's a company name, for example, it might be pretty important to have the exact.com domain. If it's a product and it's one product in a portfolio that the company already has, maybe it's not that important and maybe you just don't need to have it. So we have to figure out first, what's the priority of owning the exact.com domain? That's the first part of it. And some clients have an overinflated sense of their own importance and they think, oh, our product has to have the exact.com. But if nobody is going to be going to purchase that product directly from the website, like what's the point? Maybe you just don't need it. So if they feel like it's okay not to have the .com, we might go through several different extensions. So we might put a word after it, and it might be, if it's a company name, but they don't really need the exact .com, it might be something company or something co.com. And that can often turn up available domains, or put something in front of it. Many companies now, especially, will prefix something in front of their name, like go name
Go
or try
get,
name.
try.
Go get something. So there's different ways that you can do that. And Maria's great at coming up with different ways of doing that in a way that won't spoil the name, but will allow them to have a .com for it. When we're dealing with huge companies, like if we're working with Microsoft or NBC or one of the others, they've got so much money that if the domain is for sale or it looks like it might be something that could be acquired, we just send them to Bill and say, look, we know it's going to cost a bunch of money. And if anybody can get this domain for you, it's him. And for them, it's nothing, lunch money to buy a very expensive domain. It doesn't matter because they really want to own that intellectual property. So it all depends on who the client is, what their needs are, what the thing is that we're naming, and what the expectation is for the longevity as well. I was going to mention before, when we're doing naming for startups especially, we always like to find out what their 10-year plan is, because some companies think they're going to be around forever. Okay, in that case, maybe getting the exact.com is actually very important. But many companies only plan to be around for a couple of years because their long term is we're going to be acquired by Google. So it doesn't matter. Like, we just need to have a name that we can use for 2 years that nobody else has trademarked. We really don't care about what the domain is. We're going to be acquired and the name's going to go away. So in that case, it doesn't matter. So naming for us is both strategic and creative. And you always have to combine those two things to get the best result for your client.
Yeah, if I could just add on, with the NBC spinoff, Versant actually goes with Versant Media. They're a holding company and they're not a specific entertainment asset on their own. So it works perfectly fine for them, but that wouldn't be the case for other companies. I mean, we do still believe that .com is king and typically advocate for that. But the other piece of it is that if a client tells us they absolutely have to have the .com, it shapes the creative in a way. And first of all, we need to find out what their budget is. If their budget is $10,000, it's obviously going to be very different than if their budget is $500,000. And if they say we want a short real word and our budget is $10,000, we pretty much have to have a conversation with them. So there's the very upfront, we talk about what their domain name needs are, and if they're open to a .ai or a .io, or they're open to appending with a prefix or a suffix. And if they're not, what is the concrete budget? And then that does shape the creative. We're not going to be presenting a ton of common, positive, real words because it's simply not going to be an option for them.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm curious if, especially after your UDRP experience, do you ever have clients who say, oh, well, can't we just get that name through a lawsuit or cyber squatting, that sort of thing?
I don't know if they talk about legal ways to acquire a domain, but they certainly frequently need some education about what domain names cost.
Yeah.
That is definitely a conversation. But a lot of our clients are pretty sophisticated at this point about what it's going to take. But, with that said, there are a lot of great names on the aftermarket that don't cost a ton. So it really depends on what they're looking for.
Like brightpalette.com and favefactor.com and other ones that you can find at catchwordaccelerator.com.
Yes.
You don't need to hire them to pick a name for you. They've already done it. Just go pick.
Please come.
And you mentioned a 10-year plan. Do you also have a discussion on when people are like, oh, this domain's going to cost too much? The whole, hey, if you're going to be using it for 10 years and you amortize it over that time.
Totally. Well, it is the same discussion that we have when we're negotiating a price with a client. If they come to us for a naming job, right? Like, we get people saying to us, why should I spend all this money for you to develop a name? Aren't you just writing them on cocktail napkins in a bar? And there's some education that has to go there too. And we always tell them, if you plan on being around, the name is the foundation for your brand. It's the one thing that's probably never going to change. You might change your logo, you might change your tagline, but the name is going to be the thing that stays with you through the course of whatever this company is going to be. Even if the company changes their business model, they're probably going to keep the name. So it's worth investing in a name now for an asset that you will always have, that you can put money into, and it will give you an incredible ROI. Like, the name really has this ROI that's almost incalculable when you think about really big brands. And so it's the same for the domain, right? What are you going to do? What's your ROI going to be? How much are you going to invest in this? So that's all the strategy. I will say, I'm sure you've talked about this, but when Elon Musk decided to rebrand Twitter to X, to everyone, it just seemed like a huge mistake because they spent so many years building that brand, that name, right? Everybody knew what Twitter meant. It represented something. And then he just threw it away. And
But he had the domain name.
He just took all the goodwill that they'd spent,
Right.
20 years putting into that, which any company would kill for to get the kind of brand recognition and respect that they had. And it just seems like an insane thing to do when you've spent so much on it and worked so hard to build it up. You don't throw that away.
But now a tweet is like a post, and
But nobody says that. They still call them tweets, and people still call it
it's
Twitter.
something super generic. Yeah.
The bird social media, those guys.
Yeah, there you go. Well, this has been really fascinating. It's great to hear about this from the perspective of a linguist and Laurel and people that work with companies all the time on selecting names and kind of what goes through their minds. So, Maria, Laurel, I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
My guests this week have been Maria Seifer and Laurel Sutton. They are the co-founders of the naming agency Catchword. That's a wrap on this week's Domain Name Wire podcast. You can listen to all previous episodes at dnw.com/podcast or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening.